And we've got the exit row here. First off, I want to thank Tim Schaaf. Very, very gratefully. Tim got coerced into coming to talk to us about this subject over a game of golf. Just mentioned he worked at the shelter. We thought, oh, great. This is a subject of great interest to our group. So we also know that last year this was a big topic of interest in the political arena. Lots of different discussions on policies. And I know it's not amplifying. It's recording. We're doing this for the recording. There was a lot of discussion about different policies and different plans and etc. And different council members or candidates were advocating different things. So this is a really good opportunity 1 year on to actually find out what has been happening in the last 12 months. Certain decisions were taken, certain actions have happened. And we're very fortunate. Tim's been working in the shelter for almost 25 years, coming up for retirement, I believe, as well. So he's got phenomenal experience to share. So this is a chance we're going to go through a bunch of questions, probably throughout the first hour, talking about various themes and questions, some of the common things we all talk about in our own time. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. We do have question cards and pens. It's such a small room, I'd probably encourage you to just stand up and ask your question. But if you want to note down your question, because you may forget the context, we can give you the cards to write the questions down anyway. So before I go on for too much further, I'd like to hand over to Tim. Tim, could you just talk a little bit about yourself and your background? Obviously, I haven't given justice to all your time there, and just explain, what you've been doing in the last 25 years. Oops, Shirley.
Sure, thanks. So appreciate y'all having me in, and hopefully you're clapping at the end of this deal as well. So, so I got to Boulder myself in '93, and I left Connecticut. Just kind of, and the reason I tell you all this because it fits into how I ended up at the shelter. Just kind of looking to change the direction of my life, to be honest with you. Got to town, kind of ran out of money, was staying with some friends, got a job. Niwat's curse kicked in, and here I am 30 years later, house, wife, well, going to retire out of this shelter organization, which is just fascinating to me that it played out that way. So, but in 2000, what happened was I'd spent most of my life working on golf courses or doing landscaping, had my own company at one point. But body was starting to wear down, wanted to change the direction of my life. A friend of mine was working at the shelter. He just stopped by to say hello. I asked if they were hiring. He said they were, so I started as program staff in September of 2000. Worked my way up to case manager, then lead case manager, and now I'm client services manager. There's a couple other things in there, but that's really how I ended up to where I am today. So what I do now is I supervise our in-house case management team. It's 6 case managers. That doubled, you probably heard we opened up the day services up there, the day center, right? So that doubled our team with some funding that we got from the city and the county. So so that's kind of how I ended up there. It was a really good fit for me in the sense that, one, where I was at in my life and I wanted to make the change, but two, my life experience just put me right in a place where I could really relate to the people that I was working with. And I think that was one of the things that really made it a real natural fit for me. And so I did go to school. I got a degree in sociology while I was there, so which was good, because if I went to school when I was 18, it would have been a waste of everybody's time and money, that's for sure. And I liked going to school as an older adult because I was really interested and I really wanted to learn, so it really worked out well. So I got a degree in sociology, and it's really kind of helped me try to understand things, because I've always been one of those people that are trying to figure out why is society the way that it is. Why are we structured in such a way where some people just really excel and other people are just crushed by economics and onward and upward from there, or downward, I guess, in a way. So in a way, it really, my work there at the shelter really became kind of a mission for me, if you will, of how to kind of push back against things that the structure of society that I didn't really believe in a certain way, if that makes sense. So, so it's been a really good fit. I've seen, I don't know, do you want to move into the history of the shelter at this point?
You can.
I don't know. I know you got some structure. I don't want to get off your outline there, so.
Let me put some structure to it.
Okay.
This, so I don't forget. This doesn't amplify it. This is simply, I'll stand up so you can hear me, in case 15 people tell me the same. So as we said, we've been there for almost 25 years. A lot has changed, no doubt, in that period. But I was wondering if maybe you could share highlights of what you think has changed materially in, say, the last 10 years. What are the big themes you've seen?
Huge the last 10 years.
Notably, maybe questions around the number of unhoused. Has it materially increased? Has it been static? We count it differently. What are the trends and the types of issues you see, again? Because it may not have been the same causal issues. And also, what are the major policy changes over that period that Boulder's tried to wrestle with the problem? What are the big policy changes that have made an impact?
Okay, sure. Well, I think that the causes of homelessness have not changed at all, right? It really is lack of housing. That's really what it comes down to. What I've found in my experience is that 90% of the people that are there are really just good people in hard economic circumstances and have just for whatever reason not been able to maintain any kind of stable housing. And so there's a lot of factors that come into play there: mental health, addiction, physical ailments, physical disabilities. So I think the best way to think about the shelter, not the best way, but probably the most accurate way, is that shelters are a downstream solution to an upstream problem, right? So there's a lot of social factors, there's a lot of economic factors that create homelessness, right? Last year, what was it, I've got the number here, but it doesn't really matter, 650,000, I think it was, from the year before for the U.S., right? And so that's up 12%, right? And so it's something that never goes away. And we'll get into the housing-focused approach and permanent supportive housing, but like the Salt Lake City a couple of years ago, they put forth all the money, they housed all their homeless people, they got everybody off the street, and within 2 years there was homeless people back on the street. And what that basically was, the issue with permanent supportive housing is basically there's a 80% success rate, which is wonderful, but that means a 20% failure rate. That means 1 out of 5 people cannot remain in housing for some reason. And that's even with support of a case manager and subsidized housing. So those 20% ended up back on the street, and all the folks that ended up becoming homeless in that 2-year period and ended up on the street. So it's always this constant flow in that sense. So I'm trying to think of all your questions. So yeah, exactly. And so I knew I was heading somewhere with that. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, as you've gotten older, do you notice the thoughts just kind of drift away a little bit, right? Then you're like wondering, where did they go, right? So yeah, so yeah, I was kind of figuring it might be. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I like that. So so when you think of it, for me, right, I say you, the rhetorical you, right, when you think of it in those terms, what happens is what's the best solution for homelessness? And it's the old George Carlin joke, for those of you know, hey, homeless guy, get a home, right? That's his joke. I love that joke because it's true, right? As cold-hearted as he got at the end of his career, he really was true in that statement. And so the main solution for getting people housed and keeping people housed is permanent supportive housing. And so what that is we don't ask people to get sober. We don't ask them to address their mental health issues. We don't ask them to deal with any of the issues that are creating their homelessness, let's say. We just put them into housing. It's subsidized housing. We attach a case manager to them. And this is now 35 years of data across the country, across socioeconomic statuses, and there's an 80% success rate, which is phenomenal when you think about it, right? But it's really simple when it's not. How many people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, right? Yeah, a lot of people, right? So basically, right, you're fulfilling somebody's basic need, and we all want our lives to be better, right? We just do. That's just who we are as human beings, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And once you give folks the opportunity, they start to build on that, right? And so they notice, I mean, I've got numbers here that Mike, our what's he now, Chief Executive Officer, 80, where was that one? I think it's on the back side, but 80% reduction in return to the jail, and 90% reduction to the turn in jail, 80% reduction in visits to the ER for people that end up in permanent supportive housing. So the data proves it, right? The data's there. So to go back to the last 10 years, when I started, we were what most homeless shelters were at that point in time, right? Which was, we had emergency sheltering. We were just talking about this. The shelter opened in 1982. A homeless vet froze to death right over here at the band shell, and the people in the community said, we've got to make changes. We can't let this happen. So they decided to open up a shelter. It was a real fly-by-night operation for the rest of the winter. This Sister Donna from St. Thomas Aquinas up on the hill here got involved with this other group of other, just well-meaning folks, and they started putting together this shelter, and they were just bouncing around from place to place for the first number of years. But what started to happen is they started to gain traction. Money started to come in, right? You can't really do anything without money in life, right? We know this. So long story short, we end up at what was then 4645 Broadway. So for those that are familiar with North Broadway, it's where Yarmouth tees into Broadway up there. The library's up there, the North Boulder Library's up there, right? So that used to be an old Conoco station, and right across the street from that was an old motel. It was an old hot tub motel, and I've heard a lot of stories that we won't talk about here. But people that I worked with used to go there when it was the motel. I mean, it was very interesting. It's had a long, sordid history in Boulder. But we were there from 86 until we moved into the new place in, 96 until we moved into the new place in 2003, which is where we are up on Lee Hill. So at that point in time, we had about a total of 125 beds. We had about, I think it was like 90 beds in the actual building itself. And then we would load up van loads of guys that we kind of deemed to be kind of low impact, and we took them to a site that the city was allowing us to use. We called that overflow, and we'd have 30 guys that we would take to the overflow in the van, right? And so that was our response to homelessness, right? Just sheltering people, warehousing people, right? We had a transition program. That's where I started my case management. And at that point in time, because of the lack of housing resources, we were asking people to be sober while they were in our program and have some sort of income, whether it was employment or disability, because we didn't feel like we could house anybody unless they had some sort of chance for success. And at that point, we really didn't have the housing, the PSH, Housing First, they call it, that model hadn't really come to Boulder at that point in time. It was really just gaining traction, mostly back east, Philadelphia and New York. So what you're really saying to somebody is, you have to do this before we're going to house you, right? And so you're talking to people that have really no supports in their life, right, and limited opportunity, and you're saying you have to make these huge changes, right? How many people know, I'm sure we all know somebody who's, struggling with addiction. They're housed, they're wealthy, and they still can't get sober, right? Addiction is addiction. It doesn't matter where you are in that scale. And now you're talking to somebody that's dealing with the stress of poverty, the stigma of homelessness, and we're saying, stop drinking, get some income, and then we can house you. And even at that point, we were still housing around 40 to 50 people a year, right? And so that was our model. It carried over into the new shelter. Like I said, we moved into the new building in 2003. What happened at that point in time when we moved into that new building, it really put us on the map as an organization in Boulder. Prior to that, we were just really kind of a bunch of grassroots do-gooders, some hippies that hadn't grown up and whoever, right? And we were just trying to help people, And that's, we had a lot of folks coming out of Naropa, right? All these Buddhists wanted to come up and help, right? Which was great. And so But we were, right before I started, they were in financial trouble. It was just getting really close to getting closed down. This guy, Bob Mann, became our executive director. He came out of the banking world. He stabilized us financially. And then he ended up moving back to Iowa. And that's when Greg Harms took over. And Greg came out of the technology and engineering world. And so we got really lucky right from the beginning where we had these executive directors that had a business mind. They weren't social workers trying to be businessmen. They were businessmen trying to be social workers. And it really worked out well for us. And so when we moved into that new building, what happened was people started to take us seriously. I mean, I'll be quite honest with you. When we were at the old building, we would call 911, and it was probably about 30% chance the police would show up. And a lot of that was on us because we didn't always treat them well. Again, we were kind of on the outside looking into society, so we didn't always see the police as, helping us, except when we needed them, right? The usual story, right? So anyways, once we started to move along those lines at that new building, we started to change our relationships with the surrounding agencies, especially Boulder Housing Partners, which is right across the street, right? And so, so what ends up happening is we go along pretty good from then until 2017. And that's when we really took a really completely different tact in how we were going to work with homelessness. In 2007 is when we started our first housing first approach. That's when we started our own PSH program. It was all scattered sites, which meant we had vouchers that we got through the state, and then we were able to place them, out into the communities. And then that's where our folks would live, and the case manager would visit them in their home, that kind of thing. And 2010 is when we built Lee Hill, which is the big apartment building right on the corner of Lee Hill, right? And that really changed the dynamics, because prior to Lee Hill going in, we were such a small program that I don't think a lot of people really took us seriously as if, PSH was a real solution for homelessness. Certainly not in Boulder, but here we put in 30 people, and it really was amazing to see the success right away. And so I've got to tell you one story. And so there was this gal, Sue, who'd been homeless in Boulder for a very long time. We've pretty much had a 90-stay limit at our shelter the whole time. And so Sue would come in, she would stay her 90 days, and at this point Sue would have been 62, somewhere in there, because she's in her mid-80s now. Maybe even a little, whatever, somewhere around there, we'll say. She'd do her 90 days and she'd disappear. And at that time, we were such a small organization, people would come up with these bright ideas of, let's do this, and we'd try and see if it worked. And somebody said, why don't we just let Sue stay here and see what happens? And Sue stayed. And Sue was very mentally ill, very delusional. When I started, they told me, you're going to have to wait for about a year before she'll even say hello to you. She's got to get to know you before she'll even say hello to you. And what happened with me and Sue was, I guess Sue and I, but was one night it was really windy. The whole motel, this was at the old motel, we had the courtyard, and it was really windy. And Sue was just a slight little thing. Like, I don't think she weighed 100 pounds. And the wind was really blowing, and I just walked by her, and without even thinking, because I'm a bit of a class clown, I said, boy, it's so windy out here, you better put rocks in your pocket. And she stopped, and she looked at me, and she goes, how do you get in here? And, and from that point on, she and I had a great relationship. And so when we started to build, well, when I knew we were going to start to build Lee Hill, before we even put a shovel in the ground, I said to Sue, we're building an apartment over there for people that, we're going to house from the shelter. Do you want to get housed? I don't need an answer. I just want you to think about it. 3 months later, they're starting construction, just checking in with her. 3 months later, 2 months later. And so that went on for a whole year while they were building the building, where I just kept kind of little inroads. And we finally got to the point where she said yes, but I had to get where she finally would say, yes, I'm willing to go, and because there's all paperwork you got to do and everything. And I sat down with her and I said, Sue, I need an answer. It's got to be yes or no. We're done. Yes or no, you go into the building. And she goes, well, how much is the rent again? I said, well, it'll be about 30% of your income. And she says, oh, well, my old man said never pay more than 25% of your income, so I'm not going. And I was like, well, let's just figure that out on the other side, Sue. And she went. She's still there. It's like one of those great success stories. It really is just amazing. And I need a quick drink of water, so sorry. So, well, let me finish just real quick.
Sorry,
All right, yeah, sorry. No, not the story, but so that really changed the landscape of, and all this will bleed into your questions. I know we're kind of getting out of your thing here, but once you get me going, it's hard to keep me on track. I got to tell you, man. I should have told you that ahead of time. But so once people realized how well that worked, and right away, right, the concern, right, the NIMBY concerns, oh, the police are going to be here all the time, it's going to disrupt the neighborhood. We started a whole neighborhood group with people. None of that came true. In fact, it was the exact opposite. And so it really changed the conversation in the whole of Boulder County, certainly in the city of Boulder, of how we were going to address homelessness. And we really tried to expand that PSH. And it flipped that whole model of the transition program, right, of you got to get better first before we get you housed. And that leads us to this next piece, which is in 2017, Homeless Solutions of Boulder County was created, which is through the county, obviously. And we changed the shelter from being that kind of standard warehouse homeless shelter to housing-focused shelter. The transition program got dismantled. We no longer, at that point in time, the average stay in the transition program was 6 months. So my case managers were basically, working with people for an average of 6 months, right? Now we went into this more transactional model. Are you doc ready, right? You have your ID, your social security card, your birth certificate. Do you have income? Where are your benefits at? What housing list can we get you on? They started this whole thing, the VI SPDAT, which is the Vulnerability Index Selection Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. Thankfully, they changed the name of that one because it took me about 3 years to remember that. But anyways, so it changed the whole model. It really flipped how we started working with, with people, right? And so what ends up happening now is we went from housing about 50 people a year to housing about 100 people a year. And this last year, we housed, our shelter year goes from October 1 to September 30th. And our last year, we housed 117 people through the shelter. And another diversion, which is basically somebody comes in and says, hey, mom says she'll take me in if I can get back to New Jersey. We'll put them on a bus. We'll send them out to New Jersey. We've gotten women out of domestic violence situations because of that. I think the farthest we sent was somebody back to Africa. I think it's the farthest one. Yeah, I mean, so it's really, it's really fascinating, the people that come through the door. And so that's where we are now. This just to kind of give you an idea of we're a housing focused shelter. Everything we look at, we really try and get everybody that we possibly can ready for housing. So I'll just leave it there, and we'll move on to your next one. So thank you for your patience.
No, the whole point is to hear you talk, not me talk. So thank you for that. So I'm going to focus a little bit specifically on the last 12 months. Mm-hmm. You touched on some of the things, and you've kind of built a really good picture of how we got here. I'll stand out so you can hear. But one of the questions in the last 12 months, because certain decisions were taken, there was going to be a day shelter in Folsom Street. The shelter got turned into a 24/7 shelter. What other policies and actions have happened in the last 12 months? And, what are the specific things you're dealing with? I mean, the things we hear about are the drugs, the mental illness, the crime, domestic violence, etc. You touched on some of those. Those aren't new. Maybe the drug issue has becoming a growing problem, and maybe you can comment on that. Sure. Exactly. So what is now called the all-roads shelter? Could you just talk specifically in the last 12 months, what materially has changed in terms of what direction are we now going in that we weren't going in a year ago?
Sure, absolutely. So I think other than the day center, I'll get to the day center, but in January of this year, we opened up Bluebird, which is the permanent supportive housing unit over on 30th Street. That's 40 units. It's all straight PSH housing. And then we just housed another 55 people in Zinnia, which is up in Longmont. And that was, it's all PSH housing. And all these are tax credit buildings. And so what happens is the developers agree to come in, build these buildings, and then we have to agree to manage them, right? And obviously they get their tax credits, which helps them with the buildings that really make them money, right? Which is fine. Again, it's economy, right? It's give and take. It's the economy, right? So, so I think those are the two big things. So when we got the 55 people through the door up at Zinnia, that put us at 235 people that we have in permanent supportive housing every night in Boulder County. Our shelter capacity is 180. So we now are actually housing more people every night than we're sheltering, which I think is really fantastic, right? So
When you say housing versus shelter, what do you mean by the difference?
Sure. So they with these units or the scattered site, the PSH, it's an actual apartment, right? And so it's typically a studio or a one bedroom, and so they're basically living in an apartment. They have a place at the end of the day to shut the door on the world, and
But they can stay there how long?
as long as they don't screw it up.
Shelter, how long?
At the shelter, then what happens is you get 90 stays. However, if you get into our reserve bed program and work with our case management team towards, reducing whatever or addressing whatever barriers you might have towards housing, then you can stay there past your 90 days.
So do you have a certain criteria that you have to meet to go into this?
You do, yes. So it depends on where the vouchers are coming from that get attached to these units. To give you an idea, for the Bluebird units, they were federal HUD vouchers, so you had to be chronically homeless, which means that you had to be homeless for the past 12 years, consecutive, or not 12 years, I'm sorry, 12 months. 12 months. And then, or, right, here's where the bureaucracies, I don't know how these bureaucrats think, but it's really fascinating, or you have to have have 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years that total 12 months. And so you would think, well, how hard is that to be? You would not believe how creative we have gotten to come up with 4 episodes to because it's got to be 4 episodes. It doesn't matter. They could have 30 months in the last 36, but if it's not 4 episodes, they're not chronically homeless. And that's where the bureaucracy, yeah, exactly.
Their rent is based on their income? You referenced that before?
Their rent is based on their income. It's typically about 26%. Yeah. So, and if they have no income, then they can get in for like $50 a month, and then the PSH case managers will help them with that as well. They'll find somehow to get that paid. Let's see here. Should have marked this up a little better. So, let's see here. So since 2014, let's just back up just a little bit. So since 2014, we've had 269 people who entered PSH, only 20 returned to homelessness. The number one reason people leave our program is because they die, right? The number 2 reason is they graduate. They move off into independent living. It's usually with subsidized housing. And then the 3rd is they have to go into a skilled nursing facility. So it's typically some sort of health reason that drives them out of that housing, right? And then 90% have income, is what you were speaking to. 100% have SNAP, right, the food stamps, or Medicaid and or Medicare. And it's about 50-50 as whether they came from the street or from a shelter.
What's the average age?
I didn't.
Okay. What is the average?
Yeah.
What is the average age of?
It's 39.
participants?
I think. Wait, no, that's out of the pit. I think the average age is 43. Sorry, I get my numbers flipped in my head sometimes.
Okay.
This might be premature, but can you tell us, have there been some very major success stories? Okay, hi. Have there been many success stories? By that I mean people that have really left and have gotten really back on their feet again and have come back to you to tell you how well they're doing or have helped.
Yes, there have. Yes, absolutely. And so This guy actually predates our PSH program, but we had a transitional program where we owned the apartments, and I ran into him up in Longmont at the Art Walk, whatever it was, about 3 weeks ago now, and he just came walking up, and he was telling me he was in the process of signing his 11th lease, and when he left us, he was in a wheelchair. He had an autoimmune disease, and he was really struggling, and we got him into our transitional housing, and then from there he got into independent housing. And then he graduated, into the independent, and he just kind of really excelled from there. He really thrived. And it just felt so great to have this guy walk up and say, "Do you remember me?" And as soon as I saw him, I remembered the face, the name, of course, no, and it was just great to hear him say thank you. Not that I needed to hear the thank you, but that we were able to help him get the stability he needed in his life to then put the pieces back together. And I mean, if you look at the guy now, you'd never think, he could sit down in here and you'd think he'd been housed his whole life and he was never homeless. It's fascinating. And so, yeah, there's a lot of folks that they just need just enough stability to get like, especially if they're working. If they're on disability, it's a different story, right? Because they have to stay in some sort of subsidized housing, because there's no place in America that you can afford housing on your disability. And so so they have to stay in some sort of subsidized housing, and if they're at that point, typically they really thrive with the case management, right? Because they get somebody to help them, and who doesn't really want a personal assistant in their life? You know what I mean? It's kind of what it comes down to. Yes, sir.
How many more units do you need to really tamp down the homelessness in Boulder City and Boulder County as two separate entities?
Yeah, so they do what's called a point-in-time survey, and that's where they try to count the homelessness, or the homeless people. And the last year's count in the city was 122. I think they just did that one in July. They typically do it in January, and in Boulder County in January was 774, I think is what the number was. So the idea then becomes, right, how do we have enough housing, right? And do we have enough affordable housing? I mean, you can make an argument we don't have enough affordable housing for people that are, gainfully employed. A good friend of mine a year ago now, his landlord came to him and said, "I'm raising your rent $400. And he'd been there 2 years, and he'd actually had 2 bikes stolen out of his garage. And he asked her if she would change the lock on the garage, and she said, "I can't do that. If I do that for you, I got to do it for everybody." And then she has the nerve to come up and say, "Oh, by the way," that was like within a month, come up and say, "We're raising your rent $400. And he ended up staying with his mom down in Arizona, and now he's back up here. But, one of my coworkers, very similar thing down in Broomfield. They raised it $250, and so affordable housing is the piece, right? And so when you look at it from that perspective, right, you got to factor in the bad luck, right? And so, a lot of us have support systems, right? I know for myself, if I ran into a real bad patch, my family, even though they're all back east, they wouldn't hesitate. Send me money, come get me. I could live with any one of them, I'm sure of it, Not a lot of people have that. Or I shouldn't say some people don't have that in their lives. So when you hit that bad luck, and we don't have a system, a social system, if you will, to hold somebody up long enough to get through that bad luck patch, then you end up with somebody that ends up on the street. And once you end up on the street, you just continue a downward slide, and there's lots of reasons for that. So
I just want to address a question, and I don't know if this is rumor or truth, and it would be really good to get your perspective. The feeling is that because Boulder is such a liberal epicenter, and because you guys have done such a wonderful job organizing around great programs, that other counties and other places, both in the U.S. and Colorado, are sending their homeless here. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's pretty stable here, and that's just kind of a misnomer. We're just
Yeah.
doing a really good job.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think we are doing a good job, and that does, in its own way, attract people, right? And so, but, you know, I have not heard anybody shipping their people here. Now, I've gotten phone calls of people, like, especially when we legalized marijuana in Colorado. I got a lot of phone calls. Hey, I'm living in Minnesota, and I got a voucher, and I want to bring it there. And I'm like, if you got a voucher, stay where you are. Don't, if, you know, if you can move it here, fine, because you can, you know, port a voucher, they call it. If you want to port the voucher, do, but don't put yourself in an unstable situation just because you want to smoke pot legally, you know. But no, but what happens is, and this gets to the day center, which is really the next big thing that, you know, we wanted to get to in regards to changes, right, is on January 1, we opened up the day center, right? And so now we're open Monday through Friday, right? People can stay, they can, if they're over there overnight, they can stay all day, right? They do have to, if they're not in the reserve bed, they do have to exit the shelter by, I think it's 2 o'clock, because we got to do some cleaning in the building. And then they can come, those folks can come back through our lottery process to get into what we call a standby bed. Or if they're in the reserve bed, they can just stay in the building. They just can't be in the dorms while we clean them, right? And so I think because of that, because of Bluebird and Zinnia, right? Hey, they're housing people like you wouldn't believe up in Longmont, or I mean up in Boulder. I think we've attracted people. That and the shelters in Denver are not good at all. They're really dangerous. There's been, never mind resident attacking each other, they've attacked staff. One guy got shot right outside one of the shelters. I mean, it's just really, people are afraid to be down there. And I've heard that from people. I've never experienced it, but I've heard it, and I've read things in the news as well. So, so I think in that way we've kind of attracted some people. Our turnaways, right, we have a capacity of 180. It went up to 180 in, it was, I think July is when we went up to 180. And we had turnaways that first night, right, which was really interesting, right, because we've had our capacity turnaways have increased almost tenfold in this last year, and it's a phenomena we can't figure out what's going on with that, and we're trying to look at our programs and how we can address that. But so turnaways is like, we only have 180 beds. If 181 people show up, that number one, that 181 is considered a capacity turnaway. I was just looking at our numbers, and our unduplicated clients for the year were actually down from 1,683 to 1,558, I think it was, right? And so the number of people coming through our door has gone down a little bit, not really statistically significant, but it's like 8%. But people are staying longer, and so we're looking at that of how can we adjust our programs to try and move people through, right? So, but here's the thing: you say yes to somebody, you say no to somebody else, because we just don't have enough resources. So. One more question.
So is any new affordable housing being built in Boulder or Boulder County?
I have not heard, like, there's not another, like a Zinnia, there's not another PSH unit being built right now. There's talk, there are negotiations with some people, but what you have to line up is the builder that's willing to do it, and then we've got to get the vouchers. Like for Zinnia, the state came up with 55 vouchers to attach to the units. They become what's called project-based vouchers. So they're attached to the unit. So it's not, the person gets to take advantage of the subsidized housing, but if they leave, the voucher stays with the unit. Whereas if you get a housing choice voucher, that's the old Section 8. Probably a lot of people have heard of Section 8. What that is the voucher is yours. That's the one that you have to find a place, you put it somewhere. If you want to port it, you can port it. You just have to find another housing administration that will take it, right? Public Housing Administration, right? Does that make sense?
I'll ask a few more questions. The questions you're asking are kind of very similar to the ones I have here. So this is great. This is really good stuff. So I'm trying to give it back to you guys. But I have a few more I'd like to get to Tim as well. But one of the questions I had was a kind of very generic question, which is, what is a day in the life of a homeless person like in terms of checking in, checking out? You see them walking around the streets. With a day shelter, you see them less walking around because they can hang around. But can you just describe what is their day-to-day experience of being homeless in terms of what they have to get through each and every day?
Yeah, I think that it's different for everybody. you know, I mean, here's the thing about the homeless population, right, is, here's a clear example of it. We're helping a guy try to get into one of the BHP units, and when he filled out his application, he wrote down, you know, they ask you, have you sold any property? Because you can't have assets more than $50,000 to qualify for the subsidy. And he said, yeah, I sold a house worth $2.5 million in 2022. And I'm like, okay, I've heard some stories, but he went and he had the paperwork. And what it was is he had a house that was worth $2.5 million up in Longmont, and a title company came in and bought it for $2 million. So he lost $500,000. And what it was is he was a very successful engineer. I think it was computer engineer. And he got into a bike accident. He went head first into a 4x4 post riding his bike and had a severe brain injury. He's nowhere near the person he was prior to the accident. He lost everything. He doesn't have the family, as we mentioned, doesn't have a support system. And so he ends up wandering through our door about a year ago. And so you don't know who's going to come through the door. You don't, I mean, I've heard, we've had people who's, like one gal said she had a doctorate in library science, right? I found that fascinating, right? She had a gambling problem. I was like, why are you here? Well, she had a gambling problem. She gambled all her money away. She gambled a lot of her family's money away. And they said enough's enough. And she could not control it enough, and she ended up on the street, right? And so that's one end of the spectrum, if you will, right? People who were very successful in life and bad luck, however you want to quantify it. And then you have the other folks, addiction, mental health issues, right? You know, it's very real, the lack of mental health supports in our communities. It just is. And so, I mean, like, say what you want about, you know, how bad the group homes were back in, you know, the 80s, right? But some people really thrive there. And we've got a handful of people at the shelter that do really well because they have a lot of internal stimuli from their mind, but when they're at the shelter, there's enough external stimuli that they can manage being there somehow. Somehow they make it work for themselves. And Sue was one of them. She was one we were really worried about. She's doing all right at the shelter. How is she going to do in her apartment by herself? And she was one of the people who could adjust. We had another guy, very delusional. We got him in there, and he was one we thought was going to be a shoo-in because he was such high functioning in his own way. And he didn't last 2 months. He walked away one morning, and he never came back, and we haven't seen him since. And he just could not handle being in an apartment by himself with the voices in his head. It's really fascinating, right? And so you have these levels, right, of where people are at when they come in for help, and you just don't know who's in front of you, right? And then you add in the pesky right to self-determination, right? That's the core of social work. You have to allow people to make decisions for themselves. You can't say, I think this is what's right for you, and you need to do this. All you can do is say, I have this opportunity, and I'm going to do my best to help you make a good decision, but it's your life, it's your choice, and then we have to live with the consequences of, or the consequences of their actions, right? And so to get back to your question, what it's like for some folks, you know, they blend in, and you wouldn't even know they were homeless that when you're seeing them. Other folks, it's that kind of caricature that we see on TV, right? If the loud, crazy homeless guy, aggressive panhandling, you've probably seen it down here on the mall, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a very small percentage of the folks that are that are homeless. Like I said, most of them are really just good folks, and they just ended up in really bad economic, you know, in a really bad economic situation. When those earbuds first came out, you know, and people would walk around and it looked like they were all talking to themselves, I said, we ought to give earbuds out to a lot of these folks, and then everybody will think, oh, they're just talking on the phone. They're not talking to themselves, and then you wouldn't be afraid of them. You know what I mean? Really. So it's fascinating, right? So folks, let's start in the morning, right? So typically, you know, they used to have to be out by 8 in the morning, right? So then the shelter would basically empty. The latest people could stay was 9:30, and we won't get into all the programmatical stuff, excuse me, around that. But then you're on your own for the rest of the day until you can come back through our door at 4:30. A lot of folks have reported they never hear their name for when they leave our shelter until when they come back. Rarely are they able to sit down anywhere without somebody saying, move along, right? They've got to look for a place to go to the bathroom. They've got to, we have a lot of meals, so they're always going to eat in this town. But you're also, dealing with this idea of like, all right, I can leave the shelter. I've got to be somewhere until I can go to, one of the feeds, they call it, one of the feeds at noon. And then I'm there for an hour, and then I've got another 4 hours to fill till I can get back to the shelter. So you're dealing with this idea of trying to like stay out of sight so you don't get into trouble. Here's the thing. If you have an open, if you have an open warrant and you have police contact, the police have to arrest you. They have to arrest you for that warrant. And it sounds right if it's like a warrant for a real serious felony or something, but say you get a camping ticket, right? You get the ticket for whatever reason, whether you don't have the money or you don't have the executive functioning to get yourself to the court, you don't go pay the ticket, now there's a bench warrant. Now the cop says, why are you sitting here? Oh, you got a warrant, now off to jail you go. And so the average cost for people in Boulder on the street is $60,000 a year. The average cost for PSH is $20,000 a year. That's one of the reasons why it's so successful across so much of the political spectrum, because the politicians see it, oh, this is the cheapest way to deal with the homelessness problem. And that kind of gets to your situation. Even if we had enough affordable housing, do we have enough vouchers where people could actually get through the door, right, in regards to the homeless folks? So, so in that whole process, the last thing I want to mention about this, I think, unless you have questions, I guess, but is the idea of stigma, right? We know that if you're homeless, you get stigmatized. You just do. It's just inevitable. And whenever you get stigmatized, you have to deal with the self-stigma, right? You know that that people are looking at you differently. And years ago, there was it was actually just before I started at the shelter, there was a sociology professor, Dan Kress, yeah. And one of the training I went through was he talked about this idea of stigma and self-stigma. And so the idea is that a catastrophic event happens and you lose your housing. And so very few of us, no matter how well resourced, will say, oh, my part in this was, you blame somebody else, right? That's typically our first response, right? You blame somebody else. It's just human nature. So that's your first separation from society, right? And then what ends up happening is your support system becomes the homeless community, right? That's the next step. And then the final piece in that puzzle is when you identify yourself as a homeless person. And I've watched people go through that process. There was a guy right after 9/11. He lost his job at DIA, ended up at the shelter. And this guy every morning got up, pressed his shirt, pressed his pants, walked out the door, looking for a job, just could not seem to find a job because of the way things happened at DIA. He couldn't get back in the job market. And then one day I saw him going out in sweats. And I was like, what the heck's going on? So I kept an eye on him. He's on my caseload at the time. And so when I met with him that week, I said, how come you're not dressing as sharp as you were? And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, you used to be pressed and out the door, and now you're wearing sweats, and he didn't even realize it. He was just slowly giving up. It was really fascinating. And I've had this conversation with people as well. There's only a handful of people that you can really talk to about this because it takes a lot of insight. It takes the courage to have, to see that self-truth about yourself, right? But the people that I have had that conversation with, as they're exiting into housing to try and help them stay stable and to try and let go of that stigma, they were blind to it. They could identify it once I identified it, but they did not even see it in their own lives until I pointed it out, which I find fascinating, right? So, so it's interesting. And so then you come back to the shelter, right? And now you're walking through the door. At this point, we've got 180 people. You guys, you're in a room with about 30 people right now. Can you imagine, 6 times this many people? The shelter's pretty big. It absorbs a lot of people. But, they're unwashed. There's people with, untreated mental illness. There's people that are stumbling around because of their addiction. We're a damp shelter, which means you can come in when you're intoxicated, but you have to remain behaviorally appropriate. If staff deems you inappropriate, or if your actions are, something happens, we'll ask you to leave for the night. If it gets worse, we've got this kind of we call them safety guidelines, and if you might be out 15 nights or something like that. depending on what it is. And then you're in this building with, 180 people that you don't know. If you put something down, and you walk away, it's not gonna be there when you come back. I can guarantee you that. It's just really, and that's the way it is, Having said that, right, I can sit here and say that, certainly since I've been working there in 2000, we've never closed our doors. Not for floods, not for fires, not for blizzards, not for pandemics. We stayed open every night through the pandemic. I don't know how those kids, the staff kids, did it, but they showed up. We had the fires up in the foothills there. This was about, probably about 2012. And we got the call, and they said you have to evacuate, and our capacity was 160 at the time. And so I was there with our program director, and he said, well, we've got 160 people here. What do you want us to do with them? And he goes, hang on, I'll call you back. And he called us back. You guys stay where you are. So apparently the homeless were expendable. But anyways, we've never shut our doors, ever. I've walked to work in 3 feet of snow when I was program staff. But I'm not saying that to say, look at me. I'm saying that that's the commitment that folks have to open those doors up there. And I still see it with the kids that I call them kids. They're all right, young adults, right, 20-something years old. My beard's older than they are, for God's sakes. So it's just amazing to me. But anyways, so it's tough, right, to say this. But that's kind of the overarching kind of way to look at what's happening to people when they leave our shelter and then they come back, and then where they're at. So yeah, go ahead.
This ties in with the day in the life of. Okay, can you tell us how many caseworkers you have and what a typical life of a caseworker would be, and how many homeless people they're assigned to?
Yes.
Okay.
The average shelf life of a social worker is 7 years. And that's not just in the homeless community, that's just in the social work field. So I don't know what that says about me. Here I am, 24 years later. But yeah, so it's you're dealing. We talk about trauma, right? And so everybody that comes through the door at the shelter has suffered some sort of trauma, and then there's vicarious trauma, which is when the trauma that you witness when they express their trauma to you, right? And that starts to wear people down, right? And so the lack of resources, right? And so give you an idea, right? Like I said, we had 1,558 unduplicated clients the last shelter year. This is fascinating, and this number has been pretty much historically the same the whole time I've been there. 70% of those people stay 30 days or less. So somehow they self-resolve. They call mom, they call dad, you were right, I was wrong, whatever it is. Can I sleep on your couch? I can't stay in this. 50% stay 2 weeks or less. I think last year was like 376 people stayed 1 day. They came in and they were like, nope, I'd rather sleep in my car, So.
Is this in the day shelter?
No, this is the whole shelter, yeah. So, yeah, the overnight stays, yeah. So, and I'm getting to a point with this, I promise. So if you factor that in, right, that leaves us, I think the number was like around 415, or 450 something, I think it was, people that stayed 30 days or more. So those are the ones that we target the most. We'll work with anybody that comes through our door. Don't get me wrong, right? If somebody signs up, we have open hours. They can sign up to meet with a case manager. We'll work with anybody, right? But we're primarily focused on that 30% that's staying longer than the 30 days. And that's, like I said, 450 people. So we housed 117 last year. So that still leaves, 340 people that we don't have resources for, right? And so we work on the barriers. That's our goal, right, is to reduce the barriers. And that's the big thing is to, doc ready, we call it, right? ID, social security card, birth certificate. Then we look at benefits. What benefits should you be getting that you're not getting? What housing lists are you on? That VI SPDAT that I mentioned is now called Coordinated Entry and Coordinated Entry Assessment, and that's managed through MDHI, Metro Denver Homeless Initiative. They got their database, so they manage all that. And so what happens is you do this assessment, you get assigned a score, you get put into the database, and then twice a month we call them case conferencings, and whatever housing resources are available in Boulder County come up in this meeting. There's usually anywhere from 7 to 8 or 9 different agencies in these meetings, and we assign people available housing, and so that becomes really the luck of the draw, right? And where you fall on this list, and then when your name comes up, are you doc ready? Are you chronically homeless, right? I mean, there's all these questions, like the criteria that people have to fit into. So it's, in regards to the amount of people we work with, we're seeing, I'm trying to think of what the last numbers were. I think we saw it was 175 clients that we saw in the month of September, my 6 case managers. Yeah, and so we don't really have caseloads per se. If you get a housing resource, we will assign a case manager to you, and then they'll take you right from the application all the way up to the lease signing. Help them get furniture. We've got funds to help them with deposits, application fees, the housing searches, all that. But typically, it's just really a transactional thing now. So we've got those, 450 people that we're targeting. 25% are going to draw that lottery card, right, and get a housing resource. The other 75% have to wait till next year. That's kind of how it rolls through. So it's hard on the residents because they see people getting housed. Why aren't I getting selected? It feels like favoritism. Oh, you like her. Why'd you house her? You don't like me, And then the case managers have to deal with that over and over and over. And then, like I said, the level of trauma the vicarious trauma, we have some trauma as well, but mostly it's the vicarious trauma that we witness. It starts to wear you down after a while. It just does. Yeah, so.
A general question.
One thing I've heard is that if you have a grocery cart or more full of your belongings, that you are not allowed in the shelter. And I've also heard that if you have your dog with you, you also are not allowed, that the belongings and the dog must remain outside, and people don't want to do that. So what I've heard is that is what some people don't enter the shelter. Do you encounter this yourself, or is that just something I've heard?
We have a locker room. It's about, we'll say 16 inches by 18 inches by about 2 feet. It's first come, first serve. We've got 140 lockers, and we've got 180 people coming through the door, 1,500 people a year. So not everybody gets a locker. You can fill your locker and take what other belongings you have to your bed, but you got to take them with you when you go during the day, right? And that's another part of what's it like you got to carry all your belongings with you through the day, right? Oh, look at this guy with 2 backpacks. I'm sure he's homeless, right? So belongings are an issue. There's no doubt about that. We won't let shopping carts in. We just can't allow it. We just don't have the space. It's too much of a liability issue. In regards to the dogs, we'll allow service dogs in. We won't allow emotional support dogs or just pets. When I first started, we allowed dogs. When we built the building, when we first moved in, we had 4 kennels. But it got unmanageable very quickly. And we just found and it became a hazard. People were starting to get bit. I mean, people weren't taking care of their animals in a good, not everybody, but some people, right? And it's right how it is, right? A few bad apples, right? And so we ended up saying the only dogs that can come through the door are service animals. And what we just say is they have to be able to identify the service the dog can provide. And then we'll allow them in. But then the dog has to be with the owner the whole time, and they have to be behaviorally appropriate.
I want to ask a question. The Supreme Court made a ruling that, because the ACLU stopped cities and towns from clearing encampments, etc. And encampments on the streets, is one of the risk issues. It's one of the things. The safe zones for kids was came out of that. And now technically, Boulder is allowed to clear encampments if it chooses. Can you just discuss the impact that has had in Boulder? And also, kind of secondary question is, there's also the community that you serve, that you help overnight in the shelter. Then there's the communities encamped up and down different walkways and around the town. What's the overlap between the people that you serve on a more regular basis and the camping community, and what's the crossflow?
All right, so that basically what the Supreme Court said, right, and this is my own view, so don't attach this to the shelter, is they basically said it's illegal to sleep, right, and that's really what they said, right, but having said that, I understand how they got there and made that decision, right, because I think that the people that live in Boulder, right, have a right to walk down the creek without their kid picking up a needle or stepping in somebody's poop, right? I mean, really, right? I mean, that's just the truth of it, right? And so I understand that whole part of it. I really do. And the issue becomes is we don't have enough housing. We don't have enough shelter. The homeless population is a reality. Where do they go, right? And so, and then they get into the loop, like I mentioned before. They get a camping ticket. Now they got a warrant. Now they're in jail. But Boulder is really a progressive-minded city on so many levels. And so we've got municipal court comes to the shelter. I think they're up to twice a week now. So if you've got a municipal ticket, like a camping ticket, something like that, it's certainly a nonviolent offense and no property crimes. You can take care of that ticket. They got a judge right there, remote, and they take care of the ticket right there. And a lot of times it'll be like, all right, you don't have your ID. If you go get your ID and come back and verify you got your ID, we'll wipe away this ticket. Right? And so it's really progressive-minded, right? It's like it's motivating people in a certain way. And, jails are expensive, right? And it's incredible how expensive it is to keep people in jails overnight. And you got the police contact and all that. So I think that, the other thing that Boulder's doing is when they clear these encampments, what happens is they don't just throw everybody's stuff away. They put it. They've got a whole crew that works, and they put it aside. And I think it's twice a week now. They let people know where they're going to be, and you can come and get your stuff. So you can't take it with you. I mean, they come and say if you want to pack up everything and go, that's fine. But if it's here when we come back, we're putting it in the truck. It's getting hauled away, and then you got to come get it. And which I think is reasonable, right? I think it's very, very generous, really, in its own way. And so that's kind of how that whole thing's been being dealt with, right? So in regards to the crossover, it's really hard, right? Because a lot of these folks, let me start it with this. I've only met two people in all my years, all the people, I don't even know. I conservatively I've talked to probably 2,000 homeless people, and it's probably more than that. But I've only had two people tell me that they chose to be homeless. And that was two kids. Again, they were like, one kid was 18. I remember, God, I can't believe how young this kid is. And the other one was in his early 20s. And they grew up in generational poverty, right? And they grew up homeless. So it's what they knew. That's why they said, yeah, I'm just living. I'm not homeless, I'm just living. Now, all these people that have just accepted to be homeless, once they become homeless, that's a different thing. Right? And it's that whole denial system. We all go through it, right? We all have these things where we hit a limit. And our mind says, I cannot go beyond this point, no matter what it is, right? And so it's the trauma is so deep, there's no way that I can process it right now, right? And so I think those are a lot of the folks that then start to say, I'm free. Look at me, I'm free. How many times have I heard some of these older guys, right? Say that, yeah, I'm living a free life. I'd rather be out here than I don't have any responsibilities and blah, blah, blah. But you want to know what? A lot of those guys, once they hit around late 40s, early 50s, all of a sudden the conversation's changing. I call it aging out of homelessness. They're like, this isn't any fun anymore. This isn't free, and which is, it helps us get people motivated that way. So it's this interesting dynamic, right, of human behavior, right? and dealing with the circumstances. And, you know, Mike, like I said, our CEO, he talks about the bad luck, right? It's just bad luck. And I've had bad luck. I'm guessing you guys have all had bad luck. It's life. Everybody that's lived life has had bad luck, right? You have to learn to deal with it, right? You know, I'm going through something now with my mother-in-law, right? We're doing home hospice with her. Not to get too personal, but you deal with it, right? You know what I mean? It's life, right? And so some folks don't have that capacity. Some folks don't have the support systems. And when you don't have both, then you're really in trouble, right? But then the success stories, there's this guy who we joked about, we called him the mountain man, and he never liked it. He goes, those mountain men were real mountain men. I'm not a mountain man, but he lived up in the mountains for a lot, like decades, like 3 or 4 decades. And he ended up coming down out of the mountains, and he was living under the bridge, and he didn't want to come to the shelter, didn't want to deal with the people and everything because he liked his solitude. And this couple somehow befriended him, somehow got him to the shelter. He got on our radar. He was with us for about a year, and we ended up getting him housed at one of BHP's units. He's still there. He's one of the snappiest dressers now. I mean, the guy's lost all this, like half his fingers are gone. Like on every finger, half his fingers are gone from frostbite. I mean, that's how bad it was for him out there. He's always laughing. He's always joking. You know, he's always got a cap on, you know, and like, again, snappy dresser. And, you know, and I just talked to him, and he's just as happy as can be, you know what I mean? And so something along the line flipped for him, and he was like, this is unacceptable anymore, and I need to do something different, you know? Oh, all right. All right.
So specifically with City of Boulder, what are things that the city is doing well? What are they not doing well? And in your view, what should they be doing to address the, you know, housing, not the housing, but homelessness in general?
Yeah, I hear what
and
you're
we
saying.
can have Bill shut the camera off so you can really give us the true answer.
Well, yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, so what are they doing well? What's the city doing well? I think that in 2017 is when we went over to this coordinated entry system, and that's basically where they said, if you want to access homeless services, you're going to have to go through coordinated entry. So you got to meet with somebody, do an assessment, find out where you're at. That's typically where diversion comes in, right? If they say, do you have someplace else to go? That's the true housing-focused shelter, is you don't let them even come through the door of your shelter. You get them out of homelessness before they get into homelessness, right? And then once they identify, you know, they don't have a diversion option, they get assigned. There's a shelter up in Longmont, right? Hope is up in Longmont. They either get assigned to Boulder or Longmont, right? And so what that did is it created a system for us to start doing some assessments ahead of time, again, to try and head some things off, which I think is a good thing. And they funded it. It wasn't one of those unfunded mandates, right? Which is, again, bureaucracy at its best, right? You need to do this, but we're not going to give you money to make it happen, right? So, but they gave us the money to make it happen, so it's good for them, right? And so what ended up happening is then that's when they said, you guys have to become this housing-focused shelter. And that's where we might want to shut the camera off, because that was a bumpy road for me. We'll just leave it at that. But I'm still there. And I believe in what we're doing now. Right? It took me a minute to change my mind, right? Say, all right, I'm an old dog. I don't particularly care for new tricks, but this trick looks like it's going to work. So now I believe it 100%. And so what's transpired from there, right, building on like what I was saying before, we started with just like, say, 12 scattered sites, PSH, and then we built Lee Hill, which is 30. And then we added, I think we were up to, before Bluebird, it would have been about 140 units between Lee Hill and scattered site of PSH. Bluebird put us at 185. Zinnia put us up to 235. And so All of that has been funded by city, state, county. People are buying into the solution, right? And so I think that's what they're doing really well, you know. They started, I always laugh at this, whatever, this was like 15 years ago, they started the Committee to End Homelessness. And I was like, well, that's just ludicrous. You're never going to end homelessness, because anytime I want to try to talk, well, you got to talk about the upstream. Well, we don't have any power for the upstream problems. Well, then you're not going to end homelessness. You can address it, but you can't end it. And then that's what it became, right? This committee to address homelessness. And out of that was born the Homeless Solutions of Boulder County. And that's been really good in its own way, because that was in 2017 as well. Because it started to unify the efforts, right? Instead of, you know, Hope's doing their thing. I mean, at one point in Boulder, we had the shelter, we had what was then Carriage House, and then we had BOHO, which was Boulder Outreach for Homeless Overflow. They wanted to call it Hobo, but somebody had this good sense to not call it that. Thank goodness. When I heard that, I knew the people that were making the decisions. I was like surprised that they didn't call it Hobo. But anyways, so there was 3 organizations, and we were the main shelter, and Carriage House was basically the day services, and BOHO was basically the homeless overflow, where they've got church basements and church floors, and they were just putting people on floors, and at least they were sheltered for the night. It's interesting, they did a big study, I think it was the Burns study they called it, and they came in and they interviewed all of us for all 3 organizations. And their determination was we would not work well together, which was so true, but it is what it is. So we get, you know, all of this was born into, you know, kind of birthed, I guess you could say, where we're at now, right, which is all this kind of a unified effort. And we've got really good relationships, like I said, with MDHI down in Denver. We've got our relationship with Boulder Housing Partners has just been wonderful. We ended up, some of our best people ended up going to work for them, which wasn't really what we wanted to see, but, you know, people make the right to self-determination, right? But, so we got an in, right? And then they started to understand homelessness different, you know, and they started making things like Hilltop is going in, right? Senior housing down on Table Mesa in Broadway. And they're putting, of the, 45 units, 15 are set aside for homeless people, right? They've got this, and when they do their housing vouchers, they do a lottery, right? They do at least 2 lotteries a year, typically anyways. They'll put in a homeless preference, right? So because what they realize is that folks that are already housed and looking for subsidized housing have a higher chance of being successful than people living on the street. And when I say successful, I mean actually getting through the voucher process, because it's not an easy thing, right? And so, and that's because of our working back and forth together, right? And so it's all about collaboration in my mind. And I think that's where, you know, Boulder, you know, it really is. It's a liberal community, right? And so I think, you know, we call it progressive, right? Maybe keep it a little more politically correct and for the camera and my boss, right? But anyways, I think that, you know, when I talk about like the criminal justice system and like what they're doing with municipal court and what they're doing with the camping tickets, and there's all this collaboration, and we're looking at it as a holistic problem, right? It's not just the shelters, the homeless shelter, and they got to fix the problem. We still get that. We get calls, right, especially after the day center started. Hey, your people are down by the bus stop, and you need to. What are they? They're not our people, number one. We don't have any authority over them, you know. I mean, in the building, I'll jingle my keys and I'll say, look, staff, you guys need to stop saying what you're saying. You know, if you want to stay, you got to stop anyways. You know, that's the only authority I have over them. I don't have authority over people, right? We don't as an agency, right? So it becomes this idea of how do we address it? And again, I say tongue in cheek about, you know, the whole upstream issues, and that'd be a whole nother hour-and-a-half conversation that probably shouldn't be filmed. But the issue becomes, this is the reality of the world we live in, and how do we want to deal with this reality? And these are human beings. They really are. And so how do we want to help these people, right? And for me, one of the things, my own personal belief is that I feel like I need to help the people that need to be helped. That's just, that was one of the things at that point, turning point for me, and when I was 40, I was like, I want to change the direction of my life. I don't feel like I'm doing enough to give back. I need to do something different. And I just happened to stumble into this job, and to be quite honest with you, if it wasn't for a couple of choices in my life, I could have easily been staying at that shelter as opposed to be working there, So that's how I look at things, And so, and I see a lot of that kind of similar thinking of like, this is not just this person made a bad decision, and therefore, we've got to they have to just pick themselves up by their bootstraps and live with the consequences of their life. I believe in that to a certain extent, right? I'm of that generation, right? You know what I mean? You got to earn your life. You got to, earn your living. I mean, you got to work hard and that kind of thing. But I also realize that not everybody, life's a lottery, right? Now we're getting into my own personal beliefs, but life is a lottery, right? Right out of the womb, life is a lottery, right? And wealth, health, we can list them all, right? And some people lose the lottery right out of the chute, right? And so what are we doing for those folks? That's the way I look at it, right? And so I've been blessed, and, we've got a nice house. We're up in Longmont, and, I can't complain with my life, no matter all the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm glad for all of it, to be quite honest with you. But it, I got to feel like, I owe something. I owe something to my community. I can't change the world. I can change my community. That's the way I look at it. So I'm sorry I got a little on the stump there, but I'll step off.
You've had a few, but I'll come back. Please keep your questions in your head.
Lack of ability of like family with young children to be able to access those things. So there's this sort of what I see as the empathy gap now. When you describe homelessness, people say, "Oh, those people." So what are your thoughts in like how do you what do you talk about when people mention those things to you, and how does one go about actually differentiating those groups and trying to identify a right approach or solution to those things?
Yeah, boy, that's how much more time we got? Like, lost their job, lost their apartment, ended up on the street, right? Is trying to get back into the workforce, trying to get back into housing. So for me, the general idea then, right, is this idea of empathy, right? And so I think that trying to see the human side of things, but you have to kind of balance it with, like you said, like I was saying before, right? You'd love to just take your kid or even yourself, go for a walk down on the creek without having to worry about, with a sandal on, stepping on a needle or something like that, right? There's a real impact of people living in our community like that, right? And so to me, it's like, it's really just comes down to just a personal decision of how you as an individual, the rhetorical you, I'm pointing at you, but I don't mean to single you out, right? How you as an individual is going to deal with it yourself, Now, having said that, right, 24 years working at the shelter, we bought this house in Longmont. This Agape transitional housing was kind of 3 blocks around the corner. And I'm in the garage one day working, and this guy stops, and right on the corner of our property line, and he flips his bike over, and he starts working on his bike. And my immediate thought is, what are you doing? What are you doing over there? I know, you're from that place over there. And I was like, oh my God, you know what I mean? That's like me, right? Here I am, like, oh, I've committed my life to help, and now I'm like ready to, get the shotgun out and chase the guy off my property. It's just crazy, you know what I mean? So there's a reaction, right? There's a reaction that I think we all have to honor, right? Our personal safety. From my view, and again, this is not the shelter, my view, safety's an illusion. We don't know especially in this world, right? As violent as this world has become, we don't know who's going to do what at any point in time, right? But having said that, that doesn't mean we have to walk around like in terror, worried about it. And then like the obvious things that we can deal with, should be dealt with, And so like when people call us and say, hey, there's people hanging around at the underpass, Rosewood, right up there in North Boulder, what are you going to do? What we're going to do, what any citizen should do, we're going to call the police and say there's a complaint about behavior up there. The big one now is right where Broadway tees into 36 up there. And there's Laramie, is that road going up. Well, you guys live up there, don't you? Yeah, I could see you shaking your head. That's good. Well, you know, folks have just kind of started camping out up there, right? That's what it is Boulder passed an ordinance that you can no longer panhandle in the medians. And that is because this guy, John, was the last one, and I met John when he first came to the shelter, and he was drunk, and he fell over in front of an oncoming car, and they hit him, and the city said, that's it, we're passing an ordinance, no more panhandling in the medians, because it's just a safety risk. John had, you know, the halo where they put the screws in your skull and everything, right? So, and that's a whole nother story. I could go 15 minutes on John's stories, but be all that as it may, right? So that end of Broadway there is county. So that ordinance doesn't come into play. So they can panhandle right there at that stoplight. And so, and they make a lot of money there. They just do. And so what do? They hang out under the shade trees by Laramie, and they just kind of congregate like people will do, right? We're kind of herd animals, right? Human beings are herd animals, right? And so I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying this is kind of how it's played out, right? This is all the facts and the reasoning how we got to where we are. So when people call us, we call the police, right? And we have walked down there as well and said, look, you guys, we're getting complaints. You guys got to move on, or, you know, we're going to call the police kind of stuff. We mitigate it as well as we can, but again, we don't really have any power. You know what I mean? And so when you think about it, yeah, we tell them, well, this is usually during the day. Yeah, for sure, yeah. So again, it all comes down to like where you're at, right? What your kind of risk tolerance is, I guess, really is a way to think about it, right? And then also how you want to look at, you know, interacting with the world around you. And I go both ways with that. I just do. I mean, I know for a fact that, you know, there's guys that are panhandling that are housed and are going to have, you know, Social Security coming in, you know. And I also know for a fact that there's people with absolutely no income standing there flying those signs, and if they don't get, you know, the $5 they're going to get that day, they're not going to have any money in their pocket. And I can't differentiate. My policy is, and it's kind of the shelters, is like we try not to give money to people like that, right? Because it crosses a line for us in regards to somebody we might be working with. So does that help? I don't know if it helps, but that's my response.
I mean, if you had the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just from your perspective, just want to know what you're.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation, and I appreciate your dedication. I have a couple of sort of harder, higher level questions to ask. I mean, I find being in Boulder kind of frustrating in some ways about, to me, it's a bit too woke. I came from Alexandria, Virginia, which is very liberal, does not have this problem with homelessness, no panhandling that I'm aware of. I was there, again, for 2 weeks in June. Another extreme would be Boise, Idaho, where two people told me they've been there, and in Boise, if you're homeless or panhandling, you go to jail. If you don't, you go to a shelter. If you aren't willing to go, you go to jail. And it seems to me, I get the impression they've probably put more resources into dealing with homelessness in terms of building the facilities and staffing. I don't know that specifically. But I'm wondering also about the panhandling. You say it's not legal with medians. Why is it legal at all?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. That's the community question. I know they've posted ordinance or signs about the ordinance, no aggressive panhandling.
Yeah.
You know.
Well,
but
of course, most of it isn't. But from my experience, there's been some very aggressive panhandlers.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's terrible when I see a young woman out there, you know, begging on behalf of her 2 young children there. I mean, I hate the fact that they're not in some facility where they have more care and
I agree.
support.
Yeah. Well, the fact is we just don't have those facilities.
Okay.
You know?
So my other thought on this is that people here may find this hard to believe, but my understanding is that Boulder's property taxes are incredibly low for residential housing. I mean, compared to where I was, they're only half as much. I would be willing to pay a lot more money in taxes if it went toward providing these facilities such we didn't have panhandling and we didn't have a lot of the problems you're describing that we have because of lack of resources.
Yeah. No, okay. I would agree with you there wholeheartedly.
Yeah, when people, by the way, just a reminder, when you ask your question, please talk to the microphone so it gets picked up. So we've got two more that were held up.
Oh, okay. I thought you were still on
Well,
this.
I don't really have an answer. I mean, like you said, that's the higher level stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like, as a community and as a country, whatever, city, state, country, how do we want to address this? This is a real issue. This is a national issue. It's not just a Boulder issue. And like I said, some communities, like you go to Golden, you don't see anybody down there panhandling. You don't see the homeless down there. You go to Louisville, you don't see anybody there really, right? They don't have any shelters. Everybody gets pushed. Are there?
Yeah,
Okay.
there are. Yeah, in
All
fact,
right.
In
So-
fact, I have, Cam's question was timely because I had a similar question, comment. Not sure how to articulate it, but I am curious to know how Boulder City, Boulder County in particular, because that's most of our discussion has been on that, compares to other communities in the metro area. We're all new here, and when I moved here, I, like Cam, was shocked at the amount of panhandling that went on in nice suburban areas, and Boulder, Lafayette, Louisville, street corners, shopping centers of all kinds, of the median strips, the individual guy with the backpack, or the woman with her two kids sitting right there in the sign and so forth. My kids, who predated me here, commented that they claim it's unique to Boulder County, that it doesn't happen where they live in Westminster and Lakewood because the local law enforcement doesn't allow it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious to know whether that, in fact, is true. How does the resource that Boulder County commits, both in terms of financial resource, like you and your 6 staff members, the 2 PSHs, I think you called them, the shelter, the number of beds, how does that compare? And does that exacerbate the problem for Boulder County because the people that would be homeless in Lakewood or Westminster are coming to Boulder because they know that the resources are here, and then it just kind of spirals from there?
Yeah, and I can't say I've got a good answer for you on that. Like I said, I got to Boulder in '93. It was really on the tail end of, it really was, a hippie town, college town. And it was just on a lot of that was kind of going away as I got here. And as more, wealth came into the town, it started to change the tenor of the town. But having said that, right, the shelter grew out of that kind of that, grassroots, we want to help you kind of mentality. And so we were just having this discussion today in trying to address this, the turn-away capacities. What are we doing as an organization that's bringing more people here, right? And so I can say, yeah, well, we housed 117 people, and that's great, right? But because we housed 117 people, there's more people coming in behind them wanting to get housed, right? So I don't have a good answer for you on this. I wish I did. Even after all these years, like I said, I got my degree in sociology, and one of my advisors, right, was this young kid he graduated out of University of Iowa, and I go in to talk to him about something, and he was one of them guys you can get into a conversation with, and you ask a question, and an hour later you're still there talking, which I loved, right? But so I asked him, I said, he's got his degree right behind him on the wall, and I said, what's the answer? And he goes, you want to know what the answer is? There is no answer. And I was like, that's all that education, and that's your answer to me? And that's the answer, right? I mean, it's like, because they're going to be somewhere, and they're here now. Are they here at the mall? Because of the mall, the way the mall was back when I got here is a little different. The stores were a little bit more independent than a lot of the big chains that are there now. So it was much more of a hangout in that sense. I think that drew a lot of people. The hills right up there, so there's, the college kids and the partying. These are all things that I've seen along the way, and I just think, like, what draws people here? And I personally, I don't think it's just the shelter. I really don't. I think that's part of it. I'm not, you know, I don't have my blinders on to say that that's not happening. I know for a fact, you know, I should say anecdotally, we've had conversations with people that said, yeah, I couldn't stay in Denver anymore, and I came up here because I couldn't stay in the shelter. Shelter's there, and now that I'm here, I see the resources that you guys have, and I'm hoping I can get into something like that. So that's happening. There's no doubt about it, you know. They're housing a ton of people down in Denver, though. They're doing that as well, right? Really, the only solution to homelessness, because nobody wants to address the upstream issues, is housing, right? And until we address that, we're always going to have homeless people. You know, you think about it. If you're on Social Security, I don't know how much people know about, like, there's Social Security, it's social supplemental insurance, is when you haven't worked at least 10 quarters and you have a disability. And right now, that in Colorado, that payment standard, I think, is $772. Trying to live a month. So you're trying to live on $772 a month, right? And then if you've worked, you can get SSDI, and then it's based on a percentage of what you earned in your life, right? So this guy I talked about with the house earlier, he's because he had such a, you know, a good paying job when he was working, I think his income's like $1,900 a month, right? Which is really not bad, right? And you know, you don't pay taxes on it, right? So it's $1,900 in your pocket, but it's not a lot of money, you know? And think about trying to rent market rate at $1,900 a month when, you know, even a studio apartment's typically around $1,500, $1,600, right? So they talk about if you pay more than 40% of your income for housing, then you're in jeopardy, right? They call that risky, right? And so that's why typically it's 30% for a lot of the folks in extreme levels of poverty. It goes down to 26%, right? So it's so layered, right? And then you add in the human equation of human behavior, right? And I'm not making excuses. I really am. It's just I've just seen it, and I thought for sure that I would think about things differently after 24 years at the shelter, and I realized the guy's right. He was right. There is no answer, right? And we've got weak leadership, and now I am kind of getting a little on the, you know, the bigger, but we've got weak leadership on both sides of the political aisle. Nobody wants to make a decision. We've got a media that wants to keep us separated and fighting each other. Nobody wants a solution, right? And so what do we end up with, right? We end up with all these social problems that, you know, we the people have to somehow find a solution to. And what ends up happening is oftentimes it's underfunded, right? And then some communities say, you know what, we're just not going to deal with it. And that's their decision, and that's fine. But I know I wouldn't live there because that's just not who I am, right? And so, but then folks come here, all you guys came here, right? Beautiful quality of life in Boulder, there's no denying that, right? I mean, I did, when I was in school, I did one of my statistics things. I stood on the mall and I asked people what their level of education was. And it was like, I forget now, I mean, this is going back 20 years, right? But it was like out of like, you know, something like 70 people, 25% had doctorates. One guy got mad at me because he goes, well, what about Juris Doctorate? And I was like, I don't even know what that is. And he started yelling at me, and his wife was like, the guy's just trying to do his school project, man. I said, I'll put you down as a doctorate, okay? And he was just like offended that I didn't have that on my little statistics project, you know? And I was like, God, man, it was embarrassing enough standing out there. Could you tell me what do you have? You know, good Lord. But you know what I mean? So it's a wonderful place to live. I don't deny that. You know what I mean? I ended up, you know, going up to Longmont and whatever. We got a nice little place up there, and I'm happy up there. But I enjoyed my time in Boulder. I really did. You know what I mean? And so, but what do? This is the reality, you know? And
I think we have to accept you don't set policy. You're following policy and implementing policy and try to solve the problem again. So, to be fair to Tim, he can't solve all Boulder issues. There were a couple of questions teed
if they
up.
listened to me, I would.
Well, I'm going to go to Shirley because she was waiting. I did have that question at the end.
That's okay.
You only have 15 minutes.
Oh, thank you. I just have one question. This is a what do you do question.
Okay.
I'm downtown in Boulder pretty early on some mornings. There are people supine on the street, on the sidewalk, and I try to make sure they're breathing, but I'm not going to I'm not going to approach, but some don't appear to be breathing. And I have normally, it doesn't happen very often, it's not like every week, but I do call the police and ask them to come out and do, so this is my question to you, what should I say? I usually say a wellness check.
Welfare.
Welfare,
Welfare
okay.
check. That's the actual language, yeah.
Okay.
Welfare check.
All right.
Yeah, with fentanyl especially, it's absolutely, I mean, that's why, I mean, we ended up, we went back and forth whether we wanted to do it or not, but we ended up putting a, oh gosh, what's that, this Narcan, thank you very much. It's getting late on a Friday. We ended up putting Narcan in the atrium at the shelter, and people take it and use it. We've had, I can't tell you how many overdoses in the last year and a half with fentanyl. That's an upstream problem in its own way, exactly. But yeah, when you see somebody, I would definitely, and please don't take this the wrong way, but as an older lady, I would not approach because you don't know how they're going to wake up. Yeah, exactly, right? I would say that no matter who you are, you're right. You want to stay at least that arm or leg's length away from them because you do not know how they're going to react when they come out of that stupor somehow. And so, but yeah, with the fentanyl, I think that's, and I've had so many of the, the EMTs that come up, like there was one guy out in front of the shelter. I thought I was walking up on a body, to be honest. This was going back a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. And I'm trying to get them, and finally we called the ambulance, and they came, and by the time they got there, the guy was conscious. And I apologized to the EMT, and he's like, "No, you did the exact right thing. You did the exact right thing. Don't ever hesitate to call." So.
So my question is, are there things that we could be doing here in terms of advocating, or just that the city could be doing a better job of petitioning the state at the state and federal level to get more funding? One thing you said about, and I'm thinking about mental health.
Yeah.
And if people could get the help with mental health, that could also help them get out of homelessness, or just be more
stable,
and contributing to society.
Sure. Yeah, I think that any way, I'm not going to tell you folks how to live your life, but any way you get involved, follow your heart, right? And however it works for you to get involved in a way that makes sense to you. I think that's how for me. I think we should govern from the ground up. I think that's how this country was supposed to be, and we got lost on that. Again, I'm proselytizing here, but that kind of answers your question, right? Because these are the larger issues, right? There's only so much that we have as an individual, but as a group, we've got a lot more power. And you guys have probably read, right? The county's cutting some funding. We're going to lose $382,000, and our budget, to be honest with you, is $12 million. I know that's public knowledge. I don't mind sharing that. So you think, well, what's $382? Well, a lot of our budget comes with different contracts, and it's specified it can only be spent in certain ways. So it's not like we got a pool of money that we can then cover this $382,000. Wherever that money was earmarked, we got to somehow fix that and find either creative ways to keep doing what we're doing without that money, or we're going to have to cut services. And that's not my decision. That's above me, but that's where we're at, right? And so, money's part of the answer. There's no doubt, right? Because you got to fund this stuff. It's all there is to it. But unless we start changing the larger issues, we're going to have the same. We come back in 10, 20 years and we'll have the same conversation, right? And so, but I don't want to make it sound like it's hopeless. I don't really feel like it is, because like I said, when I see the shift, like we went back to 10 years, and once we went to that permanent supportive housing, and how that just changed the thinking in this city, and then it became the county, it's just mushroomed out, and it's just built on itself. And now we've got 235 people in permanent supportive housing. There's at least 2 other projects I know that they're in conversation about, right? And so, and it's moved into Longmont. This was the first one in Longmont, right? And so, Longmont's getting very progressive in their thinking, right? So it's spreading out.
Karen, there's a question, Susan, behind you. We've only got time for a couple more questions.
Real quick, if we could break up, like probably in about 3 minutes or so, because we're trying to shuffle everybody out.
I thought we had.
Just
Oh, really?
Sounds like a great meeting.
All right, man.
This is a very quick question. For the people that come in every night and then have to pack up and leave every day and come in every night, how long does it, if they want permanent housing, how long does it take them to get in the permanent housing?
Oh, it could be anywhere from, 3 to 6 months to a couple of years, to be honest with you. Yeah, yeah, so.
Well, I apologize. It sounds like the library's shutting, is it?
Yeah.
Ah, right. I thought we had the room till 5. Well, I think unless there's an absolutely burning question, we probably ought to wrap there. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
I want to thank you guys. Thank you, really.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Jim. Well done. Sorry to cut out.
Oh, no, that's great. Thanks.
You're good.